Hi, my name is Jasjeet Singh. I'm a professor of strategy. Welcome everyone here, and it is a real privilege and honor to especially welcome our guest, Paul Polman. Paul, you spoke at the Europe campus a few months ago, so I'm glad you got a chance to come here because equity is something we take very seriously at INSEAD. Paul is a member of the advisory board of the Hoffmann Institute of Business and Society, whose mission is to help INSEAD lead the way in transforming business education and ensuring that the world's leaders and their organizations truly benefit the society at large. So part of this mission consists of equipping current and future leaders with the tools and knowledge needed to move the world towards a path of sustainable, inclusive, and responsible development. This mission is, of course, well aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which Paul is here to talk about. As most of you know, Paul was the CEO of Unilever from 2009 to 2018. In fact, I've been very fortunate to work with his team in running a joint INSEAD Unilever executive program a few years ago at their 4-acre campus right next door, and also doing a case study on how the Sustainable Living Plan played out in the context of Vietnam in recent years. Paul has also actively sought cooperation across organizations beyond just leading efforts around the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And really, he's been a leading figure in implementing across the ecosystem long-term sustainable strategies and driving systematic change. And obviously, he holds a lot of very important positions in leading these efforts. He's the chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, a member of the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum, and the vice chair of the UN Global Compact, just to name a few of those positions. He has also been the chair of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Paul has received numerous awards and accolades in recognition of his contribution to building a more sustainable world, and his efforts certainly go far beyond just the business world to have a much broader conversation about these issues. He, in fact, played a significant role in developing the SDGs in the first place and is now promoting action towards their delivery as a member of the SDG advocacy group. So I really can't think of a better person than him to kick off the Hoffmann Institute's SDGs Speaker Series, whose goal would be to provide a platform for students and for our broader community to connect with inspiring role models like him and learn how we could all play our part in this very important journey we are all on. So as I invite Paul to come on stage and deliver his keynote address to us, please join me in welcoming Paul Polman with a round of applause.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm actually going to walk around, if you don't mind, because I just flew in and I didn't have much sleep. So if I walk around, I might stay awake. If I drop down, don't do anything. I'm probably sleeping and I need to catch up. Just go home and wait till I wake up again and we continue the lecture. Does that make sense? Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, thanks, Jasjeet, for the wonderful introduction. As I was taking my plane yesterday to come here, I was actually at the airport and I overheard some people talking. And as you probably well know, it's very unpolite to listen in, but we all do it, so I might as well do it as well. So I quickly found out that one was a doctor, one was an engineer, and one was an economist. And the doctor was bragging that he had the oldest profession. He said, you know, if you go back to the book of Genesis, you see that Eve came out of the rib of Adam. Both survived. So first successful operation. We're the oldest profession. And the engineer said, I don't think so. I think we're the oldest profession. When you look at the universe, it was chaos before, and then we created something that functions in order. One turns around the other, and it's all explainable. And if anybody is well placed to make order out of chaos, it's engineers. So we have the oldest profession. And the economist said, I don't think so, I don't think so. Both of them look at him and say, why? That we have the oldest profession. Because who created chaos in the first place? And that brings me here a little bit, because we're a little bit in chaos. Dickens wrote his book in 1859, The Tale of Two Cities. He was talking about Paris and London. He was saying it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the spring of hope, it's the winter of despair. If you go to Fontainebleau, by the way, in the spring, it's the spring of hope. No better place. But anyway, we are a little bit in that situation. If you look over the last 50 years, we have lifted more people out of poverty than ever in human history. GDP has grown 6 times over that period. Population has grown 3 times over that period. Over 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Many in these parts of the world, China obviously being a big engine of that. We live longer and healthier lives. More people have access to education or clean drinking water or sanitation than in any time in human history. And yes, more people actually are having opportunities to access. More women actually in the workforce or in education than any time in human history. I'm not saying it's enough, but I'm saying it's actually, we've made quite some progress. Anybody that will be born right now would be very excited. If I had to do it over again, I'd love to be born now. The opportunities are enormous. It's the best of times. Unfortunately, that's true for many, and increasingly so, but not for all. We've also seen that it is probably the worst of times that we have to deal with. The crisis of 2007, 2008, I think has brought to light the financial crisis I talk about that then became the economic crisis, or you could argue now, if you look at the US or Brexit and some other places, political crisis. I would call it the crisis of morality for another discussion. But it has brought to light that our system of economic growth is probably unsustainable. High levels of debt at individual and at country level. High levels of overconsumption, leaving too many people behind. Any system where too many people are left behind, it will ultimately rebel against itself. And that's what you're seeing now. The yellow jackets in France, just a simple example of it. A tip of the iceberg. Not a French issue, by the way, a global issue. The French just have a little bit higher appetite to go on strike. So they're trendsetters in that respect. Our world is severely being challenged. The first one is obviously the planetary boundaries. We're hitting the limits of our planetary boundaries. Many would actually say that we are well overusing the resources that we can replenish. And we see it showing up in many areas. Plastics is a good example. All of a sudden the hot topic of the day. On the trajectory that we have more plastics in the ocean than fish by 2050. Any fish you buy right now has a 90% probability there's plastics in there. Every minute we put a truckload of plastic in the oceans continuously. Since I've been talking, 6 or 7 truckloads again have been dumped into the oceans. Not a good thing. 86% of the value of plastics is lost after one use. We don't seem to care. Doesn't work. There's a limit to that. We see the same on climate change, probably the most burning issue. We're well ahead of the 1.5 degrees that we can afford. 1.5 degrees would require us to max peaking by 2020 and to be net zero in carbon emission by 2050. We're well off track. Not one country is even close to sticking to the Paris agreements, if you're familiar with that. The devastating effects of climate change are visible all around us on a daily basis. This year, last year, again, 17 out of the last 18 years were the hottest years on record. Last year again, and probably this year will be another one. Mother Nature increasingly sending its invoices. Deforestation, supposed to come down. These are the lungs of the world. Without that, we can't really breathe. Deforestation last year up 71%. A country the size of New Zealand disappeared. Hubert Reeves, who is a philosopher from Canada, said it very well when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And that is really what we are doing. You're from India. Well, Gandhi said it well, because Gandhi said very simply, what we do to the forests of this world is a mere reflection of what we do to ourselves and one another. And if that is true, then it's not a pretty picture. We are overusing our planetary, overstepping our planetary boundaries. And the sad statistic is this is all done by about 1.5 billion people in this world who consume 75% of the world's resources. And the other 6 billion people aspire to do the same thing. We've also created an economic system that clearly works for some, but not for many. Increasingly so skewed towards the few people. The Gini coefficient getting worse in every country in the world. You're familiar with the Gini coefficient on income inequality. Last year, Oxfam at the World Economic Forum always publishes reports of what the situation is on wealth creation. Last year, 2018, the bottom 3.8 billion people now, the bottom 3.8 billion people saw their net wealth, their combined wealth, go down by 11%. The first time in the history that the poorest people see their total wealth go down by 11%. Just the billionaires in this world saw their net wealth go up by 900 billion. Just taking that money, the 900 billion, would have provided education to 246 million children that currently are not in education. Would have saved 6 to 7 million lives in healthcare if we would have spent it on that. A system that works for few but not for many is not a system that is sustainable. We're destroying the world's species now at 1,000 times faster than the normal rate, according to WWF, which published last year in October, November, this Living Planet report. Read it. The question simply is, when is it our turn? People think that it's a battle between man and nature. It's not at all. Nature will be fine. We will be long gone, and it will take nature 100, 150 years to recuperate. And she will be laughing at us. We have to find a way to have an economic model that is more inclusive and that lives in harmony with the planet. Otherwise, there is no long-term model. Has anybody gone on strike last week with Greta Thunberg? Is anybody aware of the strikes of the kids? Not many of you. Are you reading newspapers or are you just study nerds? Who's aware of that strike in a... Okay, wake up. You guys should have a better chance to be alert than I am this morning. The 130 countries participated. Kids that are now saying it doesn't matter anymore if we go to school if we cannot live in that world that we're creating in the first place. It has to go that far that the 15, 16, 17-year-olds are starting to hold the adults to account to behave a little bit better. And are we? To be seen, to be seen. Now we have a plan, which is a very important plan that was signed at the United Nations in September 2015, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the only agreement, actually, that got 193 signatures, that got so many countries to sign off at a time that you would agree with me, global governance isn't quite functioning. Normally we expect democracies and duly elected governments to take care of these issues by providing the right rules, laws, regulations, and frameworks. Unfortunately, we're living at a time that they seem to be growing more away from each other than towards each other, that we're building more walls around these islands of prosperities in these seas of poverty. Global governance isn't quite working. One of the main reasons for that is actually that most of the institutions that are dealing with the global issues were institutions that were created at a time of Bretton Woods, 1944, when by coincidence about 44 countries came together. But at that time, 85 to 90% of the global economy was in Western Europe and the US. Institutions that are now called the OECD or the IMF or the WTO, the Security Council and many other things are products of that. Anybody with a normal set of brains would figure out that between 1944 and now, the world has changed quite drastically. If you've worked in businesses, you probably are on business strategy number 15 or 20 over that period of time, if not more. continuously adjusting yourself to the changing world. Global governance hasn't done that. Unfortunately, it hasn't done that at a time when more issues like cybersecurity, financial markets, climate change are becoming global issues. Big vacuum, big vacuum. Now, it's not easy to solve these things, but fortunately we have a framework which is the Sustainable Development Goals. The 193 countries signed that, which has a very simple objective. The objective of the Sustainable Development Goals is basically to leave no one behind, to irreversibly eradicate poverty, if you want to, and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. The forerunner of that was the Millennial Development Goals. They started with Kofi Annan. Anybody heard of Kofi Annan? Raise your hands. Good. The ones that haven't, you really have to start reading the papers now or watching television. Otherwise, you won't last in INSEAD too long. So Kofi Annan started in the year 2000 the Millennial Development Goals. They had as a simple objective to halve the number of people living in poverty. At that time, it was defined as $1.25 a day. And lo and behold, we've actually achieved that. Then in 2013, when we saw 2015, the end of these Millennial Development Goals coming in sight, the Secretary General at that time, Ban Ki-moon, created a high-level panel of what he called imminent people, 27 of them, to develop the sequel to the Millennial Development Goals, which have become the Sustainable Development Goals. I had the pleasure to be there as representative of business for the development of these Sustainable Development Goals. Irreversibly eradicating poverty in a more sustainable and equitable way. 17 goals. Totally feasible over the next 15 years if we want that. Goals like poverty alleviation, food security, education, gender equality, climate change, peace and justice, goal number 16, protecting our forests, our land, our oceans, goals on sanitation and hygiene, and last but not least, goal number 17, around partnership. A different kind of partnership, not just the normal transactional or contractual partnerships that we are used to, but a partnership for the common good, a partnership for future generations. A partnership where we put the interest of others ahead of our own, knowing that by doing so we will be better off ourselves as well. And that is what is being rolled out now. An enormous opportunity. We created a Commission of Business and Sustainable Development to look at this, because the 17 goals, 169 targets is a lot. It's a lot to remember. It's a lot to internalize. So how could we simplify that? Put a commission together, all the good and great from the business world and some others, to see what we could do to make it simpler for businesses. An average businessman, if you're lucky, they can remember the name of their wives, what business they are in, and how much money they make. So 17 goals is quite a challenge. We just looked at 4 different areas: cities and mobility, energy systems, food and land use, and health and well-being. And we found an opportunity of over $12 trillion. More importantly, not only the minimum $12 trillion opportunity, also 380 million new jobs being created at a time that we need it the most. On the crust of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things, and all the other things that are coming at us, we have to assume, some people would argue differently, but I think it's better to take the safe way, that we have to, as we transition these economies, that we have to create new jobs as well. Now, business has a very important role to play in these Sustainable Development Goals, because it affects them directly. There is no business case in sustaining poverty. Any country that is doing poorly, for whatever reasons, where people are left behind, are not the countries either where business is thriving. I would also argue that business cannot be a bystander in a system that gives its validity in the first place. Businesses are here to serve first and foremost society, at least the ones that want to be around for a longer term. Otherwise, why should society accept them? Few businesses understand that, unfortunately. The result is that in the US, for example, now, one of the countries where more statistics are available, so I might use the US a little bit more, not to pick on them, although that sometimes feels good. but more importantly, because the statistics are available. When I was born, the average length of a publicly traded company in the US was 67 years. Now it has dropped to 17 years. By the way, the average length of a CEO of a publicly traded company has dropped below 4.5 years. Not surprising, if you run it for the short term and your shareholders only, that society doesn't see too much use to keeping you around. People are voting with their wallets and spending their money somewhere else. So business cannot be a bystander in a system that gives it validity in the first place. The Sustainable Development Goals need business, but business also needs the Sustainable Development Goals. To implement these goals over the 15 years would be a cost of about $3 to $5 trillion. Might sound like a lot to all of us, and it certainly is, but it's only 3 to 5% of the global economy if we keep it simple. Now, the total combined overseas development aid from all the governments in the world, call it ODA, if you're familiar with that, is only about 160 billion. 160 billion on overseas development aid, 3 to 5 trillion to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Houston, we have a problem. It can only work if we get the private sector involved. The private sector in most countries is about 60% of the global GDP, 80% of the financial flow, 90% of the job creation. It provides the resources, the funding, more importantly, the innovations. It cannot happen without it. I looked at the 169 targets once when I was very bored, and about 143 I could count were directly under the responsibility of business. Some a little bit farther removed. I would argue in the end that all the targets should directly or indirectly require the involvement of business. Even targets like corruption or rule of law, businesses have an obligation to ensure that these things are in place. But the bulk of these targets can only be achieved with the private sector. Biggest business opportunity we've ever seen is minimal $12 trillion. But I believe personally that it is much bigger than that. I would argue, and I haven't had time yet to write something about it, but I will one day, that on each of the goals, the failure of us to act right now makes us incur costs that are higher than the implementation of the total goals. Now that might sound surprising. It does to me as well. Certainly for some of us who think that they're the most intelligent species. Who thinks we're the most intelligent species? Raise your hands. These are the ones that haven't read and didn't know that there was the strike. You call yourself the most intelligent species. Well, if you call yourself the most intelligent species, I don't think we deserve that title. When we're willing to incur costs that are on each of the goals that are significantly higher than the implementation of the total goals, we're behaving pretty irresponsibly. Climate change alone is costing the world, goal number 13, by the way, it's called climate action. It's costing the world, according to the IMF, on calculations 2 years ago. It's undoubtedly gone up. Cost the world right now $5.3 trillion. 8 million people die prematurely of air pollution alone. You want to be responsible for that? Keep going and polluting. On food security, by the way, on food security, we have 846 million people going to bed hungry still every night in this world, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. 846 million. The numbers are going up, by the way. And then we have the audacity to waste 30 to 40% of the food that we produce. Most intelligent species. If we would just take 10% of the cost of the food waste and give it to those people that go to bed hungry, we would solve their issue. If food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest climate emitter after China and the US. You want to waste food? Go ahead, but you're responsible for this. You're committing a crime. You're probably committing the biggest intergenerational crime that we've ever had in the history of mankind. And I cannot be clearer. The biggest intergenerational crime in the history of mankind. For any of these acts of irresponsibility, someone is going to pay a price. It's probably losing his life or her life. And by the way, it's mainly her. 75% of the issues is women and children on all of the goals. Just giving women in the world the same opportunities in land rights, financing, education as men, it seems to me a fairly basic principle concept if we want to have dignity and respect and equity and compassion for everybody in this world. Otherwise this world wouldn't function long term. Simply doing that would, according to McKinsey, unlock the global economy by about a further $28 trillion. I could go over all of the goals to convince you, but I don't think I have to. But let me put the final nail in the coffin by just taking goal number 16. Goal number 16 is peace and justice. It deals with access to legal systems, corruption, rule of law, and all the other things. Absolutely fundamental for making economies function. This world currently, the most intelligent species, are spending 12 to 14% of the global GDP on conflict prevention and wars. And the numbers go up. The only ones that can be happy with that is the weapons industry. And the ones that still have too narrow a definition of GDP. Because the more weapons you produce, the faster GDP grows, the more peace you have, the less GDP grows. Kind of strange, no? So business that internalizes these SDGs has an enormous opportunity. It's no rocket science. You first have to create awareness. Then you have to internalize it into your strategies. Then you have to drive it into your value chains, because you can't do it alone. Your value chains are your most powerful tools to extend your sphere of influence, to transform industries as you do that. Once you have internalized it, put it into your strategies, and drive it into your value chains, you can work on more transformative things. Do advocacy. Help de-risk political processes that are gridlocked. And perhaps after that, think of even bigger things, how you can make contributions. In Unilever 10 years ago, we said very simply, looking at the situation and making an intelligent guess of what the future is going to be, we said we can only afford to have a business model where we decouple growth from environmental impact and where we maximize our overall social impact. We put goals there to have all of our materials sourced sustainably. Goals to create 5 million jobs for smallholder farmers, 5 million jobs for women in what we call livelihood measures. Reaching 1 billion people, improving their health and well-being. Might sound a lot. 1 billion is a lot. It's more than any individual government can reach. But being in 190 countries, having about 2.5 billion consumers using our products every day, a 1 billion goal for us is not too audacious. First, you need to internalize, as I said. Be sure that you understand what is going on in the world, where the opportunities are. Then build it into your strategy. It became our strategy. It was called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. All of our brands, all of our countries, the way we do business, the purpose of our business. Lord Lever, already in the 1900s, when he created the company, was talking about shared prosperity, a multi-stakeholder, longer-term model, not a mynoptic short-term model focused on the shareholder alone. Making the right decisions for the longer term. Issues like food security, climate change, gender equality, if you want to, or peace and justice, cannot be solved by mynoptic focus on the quarterly reporting. We moved all of our factories to zero waste to landfill. All the energy became green energy. By the way, a very good move in most countries of the world already today. We implemented the human rights standards from the John Ruggie human rights framework, if you want to, in our value chain. Started sourcing all of our products sustainably. In other words, putting our own house in order. And then we used our brands as a force for good. The more purpose-driven these brands are, the better they perform, not surprisingly. A brand like Dove entirely fighting for women's self-esteem. An objective of reaching 80 million women or girls in schools during their adolescent years when their confidence is probably at its lowest. A brand like Domestos toilet cleaning, trying to build 25 million toilets at a time when 1.5 billion people still suffer from the devastating effects of open defecation. A brand like Lifebuoy, with a wonderful name, Lifebuoy, has a simple mission to try to help a child reach the age of 5. In a world where still 4 million children prematurely die of diarrhea or pneumonia that can be avoided for a great part simply by the acts of hand washing. All of our brands have a purpose, and the stronger that purpose is, the better the brand is doing. In fact, in our own calculations, brands with purpose grow 50% faster and are also more profitable versus the brands in our own calculations that would have less purpose of all the brands that we have in the company. It saves cost, 500–600 million a year. It builds reputation. In GlobeScan, by far the #1 company, above companies like Patagonia or Walmart or many others. It attracts employees, clearly, over 1 million people applying every year, and in most countries, the employer by excellence. It also drives engagement in a very difficult environment where change is there, pressures are there. We continue to have the top tertile engagement scores. And equally importantly, it drives innovation. If you're in touch with the issues out there that need to be solved, your innovation program will also become more relevant. Not surprising that over these 10 years that I've been CEO, we've seen a shareholder return of about 300% and operating the business on a return on invested capital of 19%. The longer we wait, I would argue, the more attractive the development agenda becomes. The cost of not acting is higher than the cost of acting. A tremendous opportunity. Some of you, some out there, might not have the moral compass. But then you certainly should be convinced by the economic case. Companies that are running their businesses more sustainably, more responsibly, increasingly you can show also have a higher return for their shareholders over time. But it's a result of that actions they take, not an objective in itself. Now, I would argue that we have everything to solve. We're growing the food, we're wasting it, so we know how to feed people. We know how to build homes, and we have more homeless. We know how to provide education, and yet we starve people from it in many parts of the world, especially girls. I would argue that we don't need more PhDs. We don't need more things to go to Mars, Pluto, or whatever to find an answer. We have everything here. We could really solve that if we wanted to. Sure, some technology will always help. If you have carbon capture storage or battery capacity, it would even go faster in green transitions, for example. So technology is always good. But in the essence of it, we shouldn't find ourselves in the situation we're in today as an excuse of not having technology. Many of the issues we can address. We can address today. We know how to build toilets and homes and grow food and all that stuff. So it boils down to a simple thing. It boils down to all of us. Do we really care? Do we really care? Do we really care that we keep people in poverty when we live on our little islands of prosperity? Do we really care when we see a human caravan going through Latin America or Syria, which are direct consequences, by the way, of climate change? An average fisherman in Peru now has to fish a whole day what took him an hour to fish. The crops of cocoa or coffee don't grow anymore in many of the places in Latin America. Brought these people back to poverty. That's why they're moving north. Never seen this. The direct cause of the wars in Syria has many other reasons. But it was a drought that was there a few years before that brought all the people to the cities and created this explosive situation that only needed a spark. We know what to do. I would argue what is missing is us. Do we care? Do we really care? I was in Seattle the other day, in state of Washington. No, sorry, what's it, where Amazon is and Microsoft, and I'm getting a little tired. Seattle, yeah. Huh? In what? Speak up, I can't hear you. Bellevue, is that the name of the place? Well, I was going downtown there. On both sides of the highway, thousands of people now living basically under plastic. And about 2 kilometers from there, you have the richest companies in the world, with the richest guy in the world, Jeff Bezos, printing money like you wouldn't believe it. By the way, fighting a 0.5% increase in tax so that the state of Washington could help the homeless. Do we really care? Certainly a country like the US should have the solutions. 1 out of 3 kids don't even go to school with having had breakfast. We certainly know how to make breakfast. We're wasting it. Do we really care? So we need a new type of leadership, I believe. People that are more purpose-driven, can think a little bit more long-term, can work a little bit better in partnership, also able to think a little bit more systemically, to look at these complexities of these issues or the Sustainable Development Goals, the trade-offs that undoubtedly go with that, the water, energy, food nexus, and all the other things, and distill it in simple things and drive it forward with action. But above all, we need people that are driven by a stronger sense of humility and humanity. People that understand that it's not about themselves. People that put the interest of others ahead of themselves, and knowing that by doing so, once more, they'll be better off themselves as well. Some people think that greed is good, but longer term, generosity will always win. So we need a new kind of leaders. Clearly not produced in the business schools we've had today, clearly not produced in the companies where the rest of the training happens. Urgent crisis of leadership. The Dalai Lama said it well when he said that if you seek enlightenment simply to enhance yourself and your position, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment to enhance others, you are with purpose. You're a lucky bunch. I'm a lucky bunch. I grew up in the Netherlands. Sure, it was fairly shortly after World War II. But I don't remember ever going to bed hungry. I remember my father being very mad at me if I wouldn't finish my plate. He knew the importance of food because he'd gone through the Second World War. But I never was hungry. I also remember we always had a bar soap. And whilst I have 6 brothers and sisters and my parents, we only had 1 toilet, but we had a toilet. I remember the many fights of who had the rights to the toilet. I also learned the theory of relativity, that how long a minute is depends on which side of the bathroom door you're on. But we had a toilet. We had a toilet. I got free education because in the Netherlands it's paid for by the government. Otherwise I wouldn't be standing here. So what happened to me? I won the lottery ticket of life. I won the lottery ticket of life without having done anything for it. The same is for you. You belong to the 2% of the world population that has won that ticket and that holds that ticket. Free to do what you want, work where you want, financial flexibility. Not having to worry about many of these issues I talked about, perhaps not even aware of it, in my opinion, among some of you. Well, if you belong to those 2% of the world population, it is your responsibility to put yourself to the service of the other 98%. Viktor Frankl wrote it very well in his book Search for Meaning, Nazi concentration camp survivor. He said when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast of the United States. Live a life with responsibility and live a life with purpose. Put yourself to the service of the greater good in whatever you're going to do. Thank you very much.
Wow, many thanks, Paul, for that very serious call for action. That gives us a lot to think about. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, and I've been told to give priority to students, and in particular, I've been told to invite our freshly elected president of Endeavor, Chi Fan, to ask the first question. Where is she? Please.
There you are.
So Endeavor, for our guests who might not know, is the social impact club at INSEAD.
I could see you look like a president.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that very insightful and frankly really inspiring talk. My question is, what do you see as the relative roles of big corporations like Unilever versus smaller social enterprises who might just be starting out in the fight in sustainability? Do you see any differences in the potential impact and the challenges that they might face?
Yeah. Let's see if we can get rid of the noise. I think in essence what we're talking here about is not related to scale. Obviously, you might say bigger corporations have bigger impact. They do in certain areas, also sometimes constraints. When we in Unilever need to convert a value chain, let's say in tea, we buy 25% of the world's tea. It takes a long time to be sustainable tea. Small organizations can set the trends, can create the awareness. That's, by the way, also why you see a lot of small companies now doing very well and jumping into this space that consumers are asking for, of natural or bio, organic. And they say, I see the big ones aren't doing it. True for some of the big ones that are sleepy at the wheel, but the major challenge is to convert at scale when the infrastructures aren't there or it takes time. But once you convert at scale, you can have major impact. I just came from Indonesia, where I worked with the government on a very burning issue. We only have 3 tropical forests left, which is the Congo Basin, which is the Amazons, and which is Papua, West Papua. And the government, for historic reasons already, has given away 60% of the concessions in Papua, West Papua, purely driven by poverty and wanting to lift these people out of poverty. Still one of the poorest areas of Indonesia. But if we would cut down 60% of Papua, it's not very good. We have no chance to even stay close to the 1.5 degrees. So we can use our size and scale with big companies to move into blended financing, to move into produce and protect schemes, to look at alternative sourcing, sourcing of income for those people. The blue ocean there, for example, is incredibly fertile. So can you help these people convert, build capabilities, bring financing, bring institutions together to do that? So a bigger company can do things like that at scale that a smaller company cannot. But at the end of the day, we all have the role to play. I don't distinguish between big and small. You know, the little snowflake never blames responsibility for the avalanche. But, but we all collectively are making the system work. I honestly believe that. What we have done on top of that in Unilever, we've created a social entrepreneur award. The Prince of Wales is actually the patron of it, where we get 5,000 social enterprises every year now, and we give them prizes. We bring them to the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership and all the other things. And the reason we do that is not only to encourage social entrepreneurship, but also to get it tied into our value chain. Because I think they are closer to the reality, sometimes more creative, often younger people also making use of technology, and it makes our business model stronger. So whilst we both have the same role and responsibility in the world, whilst our impact might be different, however you measure it, I also think they need to be tied up. Both of them have validity, and it helps companies to become better. Unilever became a better company when it bought Ben & Jerry's, which is very much a social model. It's an activist brand. It fights for climate change, it fights for LGBT, and it's an activist brand. But it forced Unilever, I think, to be more courageous. And people want that nowadays. 75% of young people don't even want to work anymore for a company that doesn't have purpose, don't even want to buy products anymore that don't stand for more than just the product benefit. And You know, so these brands tend to do well. An example of that is the B Corps. Are you familiar with the B Corps? The benefit corporations? A new concept that has now been created from the US, rolled out globally. There are about 2,600 of those, with a much broader remit than the shareholder alone. Often social enterprises like Tom's Shoes and all the others. Ben & Jerry's, our brand Seventh Generation, these are B Corps. They tend to do better because they're more in sync with what also the citizens of this world are asking for. I don't know if that fully answered your question. Yeah? Okay.
Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to take 3 questions together.
Ooh, and then I have to remember the man. The challenge
no, so you
is on
can
me.
pick and choose. This gives you the flexibility to answer.
I'm not so smart as all you guys. I never went to INSEAD.
Can we have a mic here, please? So we'll take questions from one from this side, one from this side, and we'll take one from that side. Please.
So, my question is, how do you involve today financial institutions to follow you on sustainable goals?
Yeah.
Because that's a tough topic.
No, it's a good question. No, it's good question.
Okay. Financial institutions.
Hi, my question relates to how corporates can partner with governments and also non-profits. So I talk a lot about corporates. So I guess it's the role of governments and other players, in the ecosystem. They are not corporates. How could they collectively work together for greater scale impact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which country are you from? Which country? Which country are you? Singapore.
So,
no, because I'll give you the answer by country. So it's good.
Financial institutions, governments, and non-profits. And then one more question from this side, and then we'll let Paul comment as he pleases.
My question was more around, you spoke about how business schools and corporates are currently not creating the leaders that need to make this change happen. There's a lot of people who want to be part of that change but lack a path, or they don't know where to go. So what are the kind of roles that students coming out of business schools or in our earlier careers that we can take up to really make that change happen?
Right,
Yeah.
so a little bit on how to, especially from the point of view of the audience in the room, what would be your advice for people here as they think of their careers on how to marry their goals with what the world needs?
Yes.
So the first thing is very important. We need to make the financial markets work. So currently what has happened and especially since the financial crisis, things have gotten worse. Only if you take all the banks in the US again once more as a statistic, only 15% is lent to the real economy. The other 85% is foo-foo dust. That's how we got the subprime crisis, creating financial instruments and leveraging it up. So whilst the financial market has to be subservient to the real economy has become subservient to the financial markets. That's very scary. So you see currencies going back and forth, share prices moving up and down. A good example also is actually the inflation in the stock market is a direct reflection of the amount of money that we have pumped in. Now, because of the uncertainties in the world going up, the value of money being so low, low interest rates, negative interest rates in some places, the financial market has gravitated towards the shorter term. They discount long-term cash flow. For companies like ours that want to be around hundreds of years, get penalized in the financial system. So the main thing you can do is, 2 things you can do. You need to make the financial system, because there's enough money in the world. There's enough money in the world. You need, the world has financial instruments with a 100 trillion economy, keeping it simple. The world has financial instruments up to 500 trillion. So that's why the 15% comes from. You understand what I'm saying? So one area that we need to continue to work is to ensure that the financial market understands the attractiveness of the development agenda, so that money goes there and make it an attractive proposition by not only working risk return, but risk return and impact. By actually then getting money to flow to the development agenda, is you have to work risk. So how can we restructure ODA, regional development banks, World Bank and all that, to look more at risk portions and de-risk versus investing projects itself. The second thing that can happen in the financial market that we need to do is move the financial markets again to the longer term. So how can we bring in different incentives to move it to the longer term and provide space to do that? After all, the main purpose for pension funds, for example, is to ensure that you can retire in 30 or 40 years, and also, I would argue, retire in a world that you can live in. So in essence, they want long term, but the forces put them shorter term. So it starts with the asset owners. The asset owners, which would be, let's say, the Singapore sovereign wealth funds or the Japanese pension funds, or these are asset owners. The asset owners need to give a longer-term remit to the asset managers. Asset managers are BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, all those people. These people that I mentioned, like the BlackRocks, they pretend they're owners. They're not. They're managing someone's money. But the owners have become too far removed from the financial market. They've delegated that to the asset managers. So the asset managers need to be differently incentivized. They need to increasingly incentivize their fund managers, not on the quarters, but on 2 or 3 or 4 year contracts, like the Japanese GPIF investment pension fund is doing now. They need to not chase the alpha on a quarterly basis, if you want to. They also need to put capabilities in place to look at ESG. If you go back 50, 60 years, 75, 80% of a company's value you would find on its balance sheet. The factories, you know, the offices, because we weren't really a service economy. We were basically a low-branded, you know, goodwill and intangibles weren't that high, if you want to. Right now, it's totally changed. A company like ours has 15% of our market cap of 150 billion, let's say, is our fixed assets and all that. The 85% is now intangible. It has completely shifted. So very difficult for the financial market to judge the real worth of companies. So we need to give that more visibility, and we need to start measuring that. How can we report on what culture is worth, or training, or R&D? We also need to move our definition of valuation beyond financial returns, also to environmental and social returns. That's why the price of carbon is so important, so that the asset managers get a better idea on how to make the better longer-term decisions, which they cannot take currently. I would argue they want to, but they don't have the tools to see the materiality, to be able to compare. It's just not feasible right now. So that's, and then in the companies itself, asset owners, asset managers, and I would call us asset creators, we need to also look at different things. Many of the CEOs have short-term incentives related to stocks or stock options that make them behave dysfunctionally. Many of the boards put pressures on CEOs because they think their fiduciary duties is only to the short-term shareholders or to the shareholders, but if you have so many different ones, to whom is your responsibility? So you need to work at all these levels. And then, finally, coming to governments, you need to get governments to put the right frameworks in place. Governments right now in most countries reward return on capital, but punish return on labor. If you have money in the stock market, you probably don't have to pay capital gains tax anywhere. Whilst if you work, you pay a 45% tax rate. We need to reward labor and tax money, to be honest. Now, it's not socialistic or not, it's just to value all your different stakeholders. Huh? I will quickly go to the other questions. But one of the reasons why it is so difficult to keep CEOs in the saddle, if you want to, is that for the first time in history, we have to decarbonize the global economy. We've never done that. We're carbon junkies. The only way we grow is with carbon. We have to move to a circular or regenerative economy, whilst we are only used to linear, dig in the ground, make, dispose. So from a linear consumption model to a circular consumption model, where nothing goes to waste or where you actually regenerate. We have to make it a more inclusive economic system, what we talked about. We clearly don't know how to do that. And then we have to move the financial markets to the longer term. All these things come together at the same time when governments aren't working. So that brings me to the challenge of business and what you can do with the governments. Business now can help de-risk governments. For a long time, The governments were making the decisions, hopefully the right decisions, and business would just follow that. And it worked to a certain extent. Let's not be too critical. Now it's clearly difficult because of the global governance not functioning as it should. In Paris, we had 1,700 CEOs coming to the COP21 and telling governments that they needed to be more courageous. I remember my first meetings coming here with your Prime Minister, where he said, what can Singapore do on climate change? But now he's an active and strong supporter because he hears it from the private sector. We will not make investment decisions in some countries if they would not have green energy, for example. We are now able to explain that if you don't tackle climate change, you don't have economic growth. My first meetings with President Yudhoyono next door, if I take that as an example, Indonesia, obviously with 260 million people, a big impact, was, well, you guys have created the problem. It was always you guys because sort of I was from that part of the world. But you guys have created that problem. Now it's our turn. Otherwise, how do we get economic development? Now they are some of the biggest supporters of understanding why we need to tackle climate change because they're the ones that would pay the highest price for it. And now there also are many ways to show that you can have economic growth. I would argue better economic growth by decarbonizing. The countries that are farther ahead in decarbonizing are actually also doing broadly stronger economically. So what business can do is help de-risk the political process. Business should not go to governments and plead for lower tax and the normal things that we've done for 100 years. It should really say, how can we help prevent deforestation in Indonesia so you don't get the smog here in Singapore? How can we help put in circular water systems when you are very tight on your water supply? How can we help, like now we were in Indonesia looking at plastics. There are only 5 countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, the big polluters of plastic. How can we put recycling things in place together? So business is there to de-risk the political process. Very important. And you have to take that role. And by the way, businesses that will do better. We have a lot of projects in Unilever that we do together with civil society and the governments. And so that they don't only depend on the CEO. That if I step down now as of January 1 after 10 years, I'm sure that it will be very difficult for my successor to change the course. Because first of all, we picked the right successor. Otherwise, not done a good job. But secondly, it's so embedded in the success of our brands that he wouldn't want to give that up. But more importantly also, many of the big projects we do together with governments to create a different shared objectives, but to create a different economic model that benefits all of us. A good example in Africa where we need to create new jobs. With Paul Kagame, we started building a tea plantation to create livelihoods for 80,000 people. But that's a lot of smallholder farmers. They all need to get 2-acre plots. They need to be educated in soil and agricultural management. A company like Unilever, even themselves, cannot do that. It would put too much financial strain on it. It's one of the reasons why you can never get to the bottom 2 billion in society. C.K. Prahalad called that the bottom of the pyramid. But if you work together, it's quite different. We get a high net worth individual to come in who cares about poor people. The good thing is when you have a few billionaires, they actually also feel a little guilty that they have so much money. So, they want to put it to good use. So you put a high net worth individual there that helps with the smallholder farmers, becomes a protecting. You attach civil society on it, Oxfam or whatever organization that is credible. Then you work with governments because I need the government, rule of law, human rights, land resettlements, all the things, infrastructure. Then I put international development banks there who bring in some money. And then we guarantee the takeoff. Invest in a factory there, give training, bring drought-resistant tea bushes, for example. And by the way, we insist that half of them are women. In anything we do, we insist half of them are women. It took us a long time to get rid of the tea plantations in Africa, a lot of issues of sexual harassment. And we did a million things, spent a lot of money, social training, everything. We only got rid of it to a certain extent was when we made half the supervisors women. We're the only tea plantations in the world where half the supervisors are women. So we insist on that. In fact, we have a factory in India that's entirely run by women. It's one of our best factories. So then it gets to your question of what you do as training very quickly. I think you need to the speed with which the educational institutions are able to reform is too slow with what the need of society is. So you have to compensate that by yourself. I think we've become too specialized in the MBA program with a too narrow definition of what success looks like, and we create people who want to go to Goldman Sachs and make a lot of money, but don't give a hoot about the rest of the world. So they're part of the problem, not part of the solution. I don't have much time for that. I understand it, but I have not much time for that. Nor do I condemn it, because it's not up to me to judge other people. But that's not how I want to live my life. So if you want to go beyond that, you have to help these business schools pull in interdisciplinary, because it's absolutely key that we get horizontal in education, much more than deeper vertically. But you can take care of that yourselves. When I was studying economics, then I did my MBA. I did some other things around that. So you might end up even with more degrees and feel good about it yourself. But you have to continuously educate yourself. Nothing prevents you from getting involved with the realities of society. Many of the social entrepreneurs that at least I meet or get the prizes and all that, they're below 25 years old. Some of the most creative people. And by the way, the most creative moment in your life is in that period from 20 to 25 or 26, 27. To the extent even that my kids, I have 3 boys, they're all now above 30 years old. But in the US, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Cisco, and many of these companies, they are laying off hundreds of thousands of engineers. Why? Because they're over 30. And they're rehiring new engineers that are in their early 20s. So at that moment of time, you're so creative, etc. Make use of that and get involved in some of the things already now. 50% of the jobs that will exist 20 years from now don't exist today. So you need to think about yourself, how you stay connected. The final sentence is, the biggest human need is to belong to. In fact, it also gives me hope. We want to be herd animals, we want to be part of. We also want to survive. The biggest human need is to belong to. The best way to belong to is to be relevant. The best way to be relevant is to continuously educate yourself. The time that you've had your INSEAD degree and the money will come in for the rest of your life, so it was sort of the case when we did our MBAs, is obviously finished. It's finished on steroids. So you have to think about it yourself, how you continuously acquire your new knowledge, but also let go of many of the things. Letting go is actually more difficult, but you have to create that space. So the onus is on you, I think, until we change the face of education, which I don't want to be negative about that, but it will be behind the curve. Just like regulation and governments is behind the curve when society is changing so fast with technology and all the other things. So more on the individual.
So a lot to think about, and the hope obviously is that, Hoffmann Institute and increasing our activity in this area also feeds into that. And of course, you should all be bidding for my strategy and impact investing course when bidding opens this week. Thank you very much for all that inspiration, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
We wrap to Anna, we have to dinner.